We are cranking toward Christmas at an alarming rate of speed. You're going to love this episode of The Patrick Coffin Show. We're going to go slightly Bible wonky and drill into really the forgotten players in at least Matthew's account of the infancy. Who were the Magi? Who were these three? Were there three? Were they wise? Were they men? And what does it spell for the incarnation? Maybe our brothers and sisters of the East have it right in focusing on the epiphany of Jesus Christ in the Nativity. Today we're going to go full Magi sleuth with Father Dwight Longenecker. But before we intro the show, I do want to mention Covenant Eyes. If you go to covenanteyes.com, put my name in the coupon slot, Patrick, gets you 30 days to test drive this magnificent software. It doesn't just block pornography from your devices. It also sends every page, every search that everyone does to a third-party anonymous email. It's a fantastic way to eliminate access to pornography, which is destroying so many marriages, souls, and kids today. So, covenanteyes.com, my name, Patrick, gets you a test drive for 30 days. Great Christmas gift idea. Coming up next, Father Dwight Longenecker on the mystery of the Magi. Don't miss it. You're going to love this one. Father Dwight Longenecker was brought up in an evangelical home and ended up graduating from the fundamentalist Bob Jones University and eventually studied theology at Oxford University and was ordained as an Anglican clergyman. Now, I'm compressing a lot of history here. Anglicanism didn't quite work out, and he and his family were received into the Catholic Church, and he was ordained a Catholic priest under the pastoral provision. He's now the pastor of Our Lady of the Rosary Church in beautiful Greenville, South Carolina. His latest book is titled The Mystery of the Magi, The Quest to Identify the Three Wise Men. Father Dwight, great to have you back.
Thank you.
You and I spoke on another broadcast that shall remain nameless, although it was Catholic Answers Live. I always love interacting with you.
Say that again.
I was trying to... I'm really going for a maximal awkward opener here. I said I've enjoyed our exchanges on the other show that shall remain nameless, although it is Catholic Answers Live. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Do you always answer in only one word at a time?
Yes.
That was a softball.
Okay.
Father, you're very active on social media. You can be found at dwightlongenecker.com. You've got blogs, and I guess I didn't realize how many things you do well. As a priest and as a married father, exception to the celibacy rule. What's the short version of Father Dwight Longenecker? How would you piggyback on my brief intro about who you are?
I think you already said it. Former evangelical, then an Anglican priest, now a Catholic priest, but also a blogger, an author, and writer. I just started writing about 25 years ago because, it's something I could do. You really don't want to see me try to play basketball, for instance. It's continued, and I guess trying is part of my calling to preach the word and use the means available.
You read something. I'm not sure where I found it, but it was once you became Catholic, you decided there's so much to write about. Was your conversion to the Catholic faith kind of an impetus creatively in your willingness and drive to write?
Yeah, it was interesting that once I became a Catholic, I suddenly had something to write about. I think it's because of the sort of concreteness of the Catholic faith. There's something to get your teeth into. Anglicanism is a beautiful religion, but it's kind of lukewarm and wishy-washy. You say one thing and you're not really sure you've said anything. Whereas with Catholics, you can. You can shoot the gospel gun, as we used to say, and take aim and hit a target because you've got something concrete to talk about.
Put charitably, you're not shooting sacramental blanks. The orders take, as it were.
That works, yeah.
I want to obviously broaden it to Christmas. So now we're in the Advent season, looking forward to Christmas, and a lot of people, in their imaginations, they think they know the story because they've heard it so often. But you lay out, I'm not going to read the whole account, but Matthew's gospel has a lot of interesting details about these figures who arrive, quote, from the east. Maybe we can start there. Did that mean like 4 yards from the Jordan east? Petra east? Matthew doesn't say, right?
Well, he doesn't. But before we get there, if you don't mind,
yeah.
I want to just say that the story that we've received and we tell at Christmas about the three wise men who came from Africa and India and Persia, and they traveled a long distance across the desert on camels and all that. This is kind of like the received myth. Don't be scared of the word myth, but this Matthew's simple story was elaborated over centuries, and that's kind of the story that we retell, rather than the story of Matthew. But to get to your question, Matthew just says they came from the east, and we have to understand the context of all of this. It sounds really vague, but for Matthew and his audience, it wouldn't have been. But we have to kind of set the context a bit further on why did people think that they came from Persia? Mm-hmm. After 70 A.D., when Jerusalem was destroyed, the Jews were dispersed, but so were the Jewish Christians. And the center for Christianity moved north to Antioch and then into Asia Minor, Turkey, and then also west into Greece and Italy. And if you're in Turkey, Greece, or Italy, and you read Matthew says they came from the east, well, that would be Persia, which is the territory of present-day Iraq and Iran. Mm-hmm. Also, he used the word Magi, and the Magi were actually a caste of soothsayers and wise men, kind of shamans and so forth, in ancient Persia. And so they put 2 and 2 together and got 5. And in fact, Matthew's gospel is written before the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's written to Judeans and the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem and around Judea. If you're living there, the east is not Persia. The east is Arabia, across the Jordan, as you said. And the civilization occupying that territory were the Nabateans. Mm-hmm. And their capital was, as you said, Petra. So I began to dig into the Nabatean culture and the Nabatean history, and all the pieces fit together marvelously for the wise men to have come from Petra, from Arabia, yep, not from Persia.
Let me interject a Bible wonk question for laymen, because we can get deep into scholarly weeds about Q and authorship and who Matthew was and so on. Let me ask you something really straightforward about something you just said, because I think it sheds light on the historicity of the mm-hmm. Gospels, as the church has traditionally taught. When you say Matthew's Gospel had to have been written before the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem, how do you know that? What's the one big clue?
Yeah, in the dating, in the book, I actually talk about the dating of the New Testament. Brand Pitry and other people do this as well in a really great way. But the Bible scholars used to date the New Testament from 70 A.D., and they said because Jesus prophesied the destruction of Jerusalem, the Gospels must be afterwards because nobody can predict the future. Well, they've overlooked the fact that we know the date of the death of St. Peter and St. Paul. It's around 65 A.D. in the persecutions of Nero. This is attested to by all the ancient texts and church tradition. Mm-hmm. Therefore, since the Acts of the Apostles portrays Paul as still being alive, and they do not mention the deaths of Peter and Paul, we can therefore assume that Acts of the Apostles is written before 65 A.D., and if Luke was written before Acts, which it was, then Luke's Gospel is before 65 A.D., and if Luke used Mark and an earlier version of Matthew, then all of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are written well before 65 A.D., mm-hmm. and some scholars are pushing it back to into the 50s and maybe even to the late 40s.
And didn't, again, I want to stay on the main river. This could be a tributary, but John J.A.T. Robinson mm-hmm. wrote a famous book in the sort of the height of the enthusiasm to liberalize everything, including biblical studies. And he's an early dater, isn't he? More kind of left-leaning Anglican scholar. But he hews to the almost universal consensus of the early church as to early dating, correct?
Yes, he did. And he actually, I believe he's the one who actually really turned the apple cart over by saying that John was the first gospel to be completed. I think he was arguing for the primacy of John's gospel, which most people would say is that John's is the latest. In any case, he was certainly arguing for the early dating of the gospels.
Why do you suppose that? And you speculate a little bit, and you're very careful to distinguish speculation from what is received doctrine. But why doesn't John mention the nativity at all? And why does Luke focus on the baby Jesus and Our Lady But Matthew is sort of rich and detailed to include such things as the Magi arriving.
Are you asking why does John not have an infancy narrative?
Well, none of the three other gospel writers focus on the players in the drama to the degree that Matthew does, and including outsiders from the East, these mysterious Magi.
Yeah. Okay, Matthew, there are theological reasons for all of this. John doesn't have an infancy narrative because John is focusing on, as much as he can, on the passion, on Jesus as the Lamb of God and as the sacrificial lamb. So, and I believe also John didn't focus on the infancy narrative because Luke and Matthew had already done it. Mm-hmm. He didn't need to. Matthew, I believe, Matthew's the only one who talks about the Magi. And I believe he does so for a very important theological and cultural reason, and that is that the Jewish Christians, when he's writing, are still struggling with a huge conflict, and that is, are the Gentiles allowed to be Christians? Remember, it's the Judaizing conflict. And the Jews, and remember, Matthew is writing to the Jewish Christians around Jerusalem and around Judea. Mm-hmm. So this is his audience, and they're struggling with this thing about how can these Gentiles who are dogs, come to our Lord and come to Jesus? And Matthew, therefore, makes a pretty casts a pretty solid vote by reminding them that the wise men were Gentiles. Not only that, there's good reasons to believe that Matthew understood the wise men to be representative of all the nations of the world, and also that they were fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies in the Psalms and in Isaiah, which we always read at Epiphany, about the wise men coming on dromedaries and bearing gifts of frankincense and gold. Right. And so Matthew, who's very intent on showing our Lord as fulfilling the Old Testament, also brings in the Magi to show that the Gentiles, first of all, are welcome at the manger, and that therefore this is a fulfillment of the ancient prophecies.
Normally, I'm allergic to reading on the air because we're a podcast and a YouTube channel for Coffin Nation members, but I think it's short enough. I'd like to read it. I'll never equal the majesty of Linus reading the Luke account in the Merry Christmas, Charlie Brown. But this is the account, and you have this in your book under the subhead "Believers with Blinders." After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where's the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he'd called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied. "For this is what the prophet has written, quote, 'But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel,' unquote." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. There's so much compressed into that one passage. To me, it's striking by what it doesn't say. It doesn't say the motive for worshiping the King of the Jews. Here are non-Jews worshiping the King of the Jews. I think upset apple cart's a good metaphor for it. Also, the number 3 is not mentioned. Them being wise is not mentioned, right? Despite the documentary featuring someone who looks like James Earl Jones. Oh, no, wait. No, that was Jesus of Nazareth. Like the camels, all the accretions over time. So let me start with the Magi themselves in relation to King Herod. Is there any historical connection between the Magi and King Herod? Were they aware of him? He seems to be the go-to guy for geographical details.
Okay, we have to go back and again. Well, in my book, I look at the political and the geographical and the economic situation at the time. The Persian Magi would not have had a relationship with Herod because the political situation at the time is that the Parthian Empire was occupying what we understand as Iraq and Iran and Persia. They were at war with Caesar Augustus and the Romans, and they had a treaty. The king of the Parthians had a treaty that they would not go west of the Euphrates River. So that meant that any courtiers or any wise men from the court of the Parthian king would have been breaking a treaty by coming west to Bethlehem. The Magi, however, in the Nabatean kingdom, which is in Petra, which is in present-day Jordan, in western Arabia, would have had a relationship with Herod because they were neighbors. And furthermore, the relationship is very, very interesting. The short version is that the new king of the Nabateans, which is Aretas IV, had fallen out with Caesar in Rome. Both Aretas IV and Herod are the puppet kings of Caesar. One in Judea, that's Herod, and the other in the Nabatean kingdom. And so Aretas had every motivation to get in the good books of Caesar Augustus by making friends with his neighbor Herod. Furthermore, the Nabateans were running trade routes right across Arabia to the rest, from India and China to the rest of the Roman Empire. To get their goods to market, they had to get to the port of Gaza, which is on the Mediterranean coast of Herod's territory, which they had to come across the border, go through Herod's custom posts and his security border to get across to Gaza. So therefore, they had a lot of motivation to have a relationship with Herod.
And their number is not mentioned. Is it known when 3 became affixed to the narrative?
Yes, in the second, third, and third centuries and beyond, the story of the Magi was very attractive, especially to the Gnostics who were functioning in the area of Persia and Syria and Asia Minor. And there are apocryphal writings called like the Revelation of the Magi and the Legend of Epaphroditus. And these legendary Gnostic writings, they picked up the kind of mystical, magical aspects of the Magi story and ran with it. And they're the ones who created all these mystical stories about long desert journeys and camels. And in some of them, the star is not a star; it's a baby floating through the sky that does miracles for the wise men as they travel. And all these magical versions. And then it became, the theologians started to work on it, and they said there must have been 3 of them because of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They must have been kings because that references back to the Old Testament prophecies about kings of Saba coming to the King of Kings. And then they've had names. The different cultures gave them all different names. They weren't called Balthazar, Melchior, and Caspar. Those are just one set of names within all the different elaborations of the story going on. And then right through the Middle Ages, the story continues to be elaborated. They become men from the 3 different racial groups, Asia, Caucasian, and African American, and they become 3 different ages, young, middle-aged, and old, to represent the 3 ages of man and the different racial groups. And this is why when you see the artwork, you see an African, an Asian, and a Caucasian. You see an old, a young, and a middle-aged man.
Yeah.
All this developed through the Middle Ages, but it's not in Matthew's Gospel.
Hence the casting of James Earl Jones as one of them in the 1970s Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus of Nazareth kind of looms large in my imagination. I watched it many times as a kid. Robert Powell's Jesus, I think, governed people's popular imagination before Jim Caviezel came along. You mentioned the prophecies from the Old Testament. You mentioned Balaam and Numbers 24:17. That I'd never connected those dots. Tell us more.
Yeah, the commentators on Tertullian and some of the other fathers began to see the Magi as being also a fulfillment of the Balaam prophecy. And in the Balaam prophecy, it seems that I believe, if I remember the detail, the prophet comes from the east. It's pretty far-fetched, but they began to make the connections and connect the Magi story with even more prophecies in the Testament.
My undergrad theology was pretty hard left. And when we approach texts like infancy narratives and stories like the Magi and the star, it's always explained away with natural things. Oh, it was with a kind of a subliminal, the presence of the word merely was merely a comet.
Yes.
The Exodus was merely just wind blowing until enough muck straightened up that they could get, the army through and the wheels of the chariots and so on.
Yes.
The star, it's ambiguously written by Matthew. The star stopped. I mean, did it move? Was it low? Was it like the miracle of the sun at Fatima? Tell us about the star.
Let me go one step, because especially with the Magi story, in fact, I'll call it the received version, the version we all tell at Christmas time, it is highly magical and superstitious. But as I've said, those elements were added onto Matthew's simple gospel story by centuries of storytelling and centuries of accretions which came onto the story. So when you go back to Matthew's very simple story, it is a naturalistic story. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of supernatural dimensions to it. And when we understand that the Magi would have been astrologers, there's a good number of books out there explaining what they would have seen and what it would have been. Now, one of the versions is that the star could have been a miraculous moving star that really did guide them step by step on their journey. Matthew doesn't actually say that. But that is one of the classical interpretations, and we're not disputing that miracles are possible. However, when it says they saw his star rising in the east, this connects with astrological lore, and the word star is also used for planets. So the astrologers would have been studying the movement of planets. And so planets do seem to move, but stars don't. And so they're studying the movement of the planets with their astrological lore. And astrology was everywhere in the ancient Middle East. There was Egyptian astrology, Babylonian astrology, there was Greek astrology. They all had different forms and versions of this. So they would most certainly have been astrologers who were studying the movement of the planets. Now, exactly what planets they saw moving, there are different theories. Some is that the most popular is that it was a movement of Jupiter and that it was rising in the constellation Aries, which was associated with the Jews. And Jupiter was the king star. So therefore, they saw his star rising in the east. They saw his star rising. Planet Jupiter rose in the constellation associated with the Jews. And they put the two together. So this is what most people believe that Matthew is referring to. Matthew never says that the star guided them step by step on their desert journey, but he does say when they leave Herod that the star appears to move and stops over the place where the young child was.
Right.
And the astronomers who write books about this theorize that this is having to do with a movement of planets in which, as you study them, the different planets move in their orbits, and as they do, some of them appear to be moving and coming back again. And that this particular movement, it's only a trick of the eyes. They're not really moving back, but they seem to move back in relation with the other planets they're moving against. And so the astronomers believe that perhaps they saw the planet Jupiter doing this backward movement and pausing and stopping, which it also appears to do over Bethlehem and over the place where the child is. Others believe that it was a comet. In my book, I say I think the most plausible theory is that it's actually a combination of different astral phenomena in which they saw and interpreted. And it doesn't rule out the fact that comet, if there was a comet, was actually miraculously provided by the Lord for their guidance. So there's a lot of open-ended questions on exactly what the star was.
Mm-hmm. The Magi themselves, you point out in the book, Mystery of the Magi, that Pliny and Tacitus identify the Magi with sorcery, and it suggests something occultic. I was going to say New Age, but perhaps better said Old Age. Is that, you mentioned sorcerers in the beginning. It does have a sort of a cast of the occult to it.
Yeah, the history of the Magi goes right back into, I think, as far back as the 7th century BC. So they were an ancient caste in North Western Iran and Iraq is where they originated. And historians of religion predict that at that point, they were probably like very primitive soothsayers, and sacrificial priests and trying to discern the omens and all that kind of pagan stuff. But that as the Babylonian civilization developed, they became the intellectuals. They became the masters of the archives, the masters of the sacred lore, and their religion, and they became counselors to the king, and they became very influential figures in their society. But then, by the time of our Lord's birth, the word magi is being used in a general term for any kind of courtier, any kind of sage or wise man in the court of the king. And every king had some, because it even says in Matthew, Herod called his own wise men. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, every court would have had wise men of some sort who were a mixture of religious men, priests, astrologers, soothsayers, to help the king make his decisions according to the movements of the stars, and in Roman civilization, the entrails of animals and the flight of birds and all this kind of necromancy and stuff. They would have all have done that. But in my book, I also explore the religion of the Nabateans. The Nabateans are the civilization in Arabia, and there's wonderful connections with the Abrahamic monotheistic faith as well. Mm-hmm. And so the Nabatean Magi would have been a mixture of Judaism and the ancient Abrahamic religion of the Arabian tribes that were in that area, like the Edomites and so forth. Also, the area was heavily influenced by Jews who were escaping the destruction of Jerusalem in the 6th century BC. When Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, they didn't all go to the city of Babylon. They went into Babylonian-controlled territory, which was Arabia. And we have evidence of Jewish settlements all across Arabia during this time period. So the Nabatean religion and the Magi would have had a mixture of Babylonian ancient lore, Abrahamic tribes, and the monotheism that was there, as well as the Jewish influence from the refugees from Jerusalem. So, sorry, this gets complicated, but that's all there in the book.
I want to be careful not to retrofit Catholic truth back into pre-incarnational times, but the idea of the Magi being of let's use the word pagan origins. They don't have the divine revelation God gave the Jews. They don't have Moses. They don't have the revealed moral law, but they do have an instinct for the truth. My spiritual father, Bishop Sheen, has a magnificent summary. I think it's one of his very best books of 60 plus. It's called Life of Christ. The first chapter in that book is called The Only Person in History Ever Pre-Announced. And it's a brief summary of extra Judaic religions having thoughts, dreams, aspirations, kind of longings for this avatar king who would come and rescue and liberate and even suffer and die. And it doesn't prove, I know you've written about this as well, it doesn't prove that therefore the incarnation is false. It's rather that it verifies a universal longing. Can we say this of the Magi as well, that they find the truth of Christ so powerful that they are induced to worship God as a baby, which is astounding in light of everyone else was clueless, but these foreigners know what's going on.
Well, I'm not sure that they knew specifically who they were going to worship. I think they initially... That's a good caveat. Yeah, I think they were going to worship this newborn king of the Jews. And I go into the political details of why that was important to them politically, but also spiritually. But at the same time period, there was all across the ancient world, there was a heightened sense of a messianic sense. In Babylon, we can trace this. In Egypt, we can trace it. In Greece and in Rome, we can trace it. There was a sense of a great world ruler who was going to come, who would bring an era of peace. Mm-hmm. And this messianic expectation would have been there within the Magi's religion as well. So while I believe they came initially on a political and diplomatic visit to Herod's court, they were also aware that this king of the Jews would be a messianic figure, and they were looking for him as well. Even though I don't think they would have had a fully developed understanding of the incarnation at that point.
Mm-hmm. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Lots of ink has been spilled on the symbolism in Matthew's description of those gifts of the Magi. What's your take on gold, frankincense, and myrrh? Or as I pronounced it as a kid, meh.
Yeah, the gold represents our Lord's kingship. The frankincense is the worship of Him as God, and the myrrh is anointing for His future death. This theological symbolism was imposed on the three gifts during the era of the Apostolic Fathers and the development of the Christian tradition. And there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, we do this all the time. We find deeper symbolism of the things in our faith. However, in my book, I go and say the actual one of the other important things about the three gifts is actually that they indicate where the wise men came from. And gold, frankincense, and myrrh are the cash crops, if you like, of the Arabian Peninsula. In biblical times, the Arabian gold was known to be the purest and the finest gold. The mythical gold mines of Solomon were located in Arabia. And frankincense and myrrh are both come from bushes and shrubs that are only grown in eastern Arabia and northeastern Africa, and therefore Nabatean territory. So they were indicators, therefore, of not only were they rich gifts to this newborn king of the Jews, but they were diplomatic gifts from the kingdom of Nabatea to Herod. In the same way that if the American president travels to Russia and realizes that the president likes motorcycles, he gives him a Harley Davidson because this is an American motorcycle. Okay,
right.
This is typical in diplomatic circles. You present a gift to the king or the president that you're visiting, and it's a gift that is typical of your country. And so, gold, frankincense, and myrrh actually indicate that the wise men came from Nabatea, and these were Nabatean gifts.
For people who are skeptical about the reliability of the New Testament as historical accounts, how do you assure, say, your flock as a pastor, that what is written was intended by God for our salvation, that it's reliable, although it's told in language that can be poetic, even mythical in the Joseph Ratzinger sense of mythopoeic, that there are mysteries described not like transcripts from a video, but more like from the heart of a poet. Talk a little bit about Matthew's account particularly and why it's reliable.
Well, the Gospels, as we know, and indeed the entire Scriptures, are written, and it says, these things are written that you might know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. They're written with a theological intention. They're written to preach and convince people about the real identity of Jesus Christ and the importance of His death for us. And however, right from the very beginning of the Old Testament, and this always intrigues me, the authors of the Scriptures are intent to show that they are historical. This is why even Adam and Eve are given a genealogy, because the authors of the Old Testament are saying, these were real people, and here are their great grandsons who are still with us today. And so the Bible, the whole biblical account, is intentionally historical. Now, it does, however, function poetically, and it functions, I'm not scared of the word myth, it functions as a myth, even though it's a real event. So let me give an example of a real story that can function as a myth. I heard a story once about a man who was walking across the bridge on a Christmas day, and a truck was aiming for his two sons. He leaped forward and pushed them out of harm's way, but he was crushed against the guardrail. And a few days later, he died from his internal injuries, and his wife was there, and they prayed together, and he looked up in the corner of the room and said, "Look, they're so beautiful, can't you see them?" So this is a story that really happened, but the family began to tell this story in a way that was deeply moving, and in a way which revealed lots of truths about a love of a father for his sons, self-sacrificial love, the reality of life after death, and the reality of angels, and a family's love and faith taking them through. So all of these deep meanings were grafted into the story, and the story was told, and it functioned in a mythical way, even though it was historical and it really happened. And so this is how we read it seems to me, we read the gospel stories as well. They really happened. They're presented as truth. They're presented as historical. They can be shown to be historical, but they also function on us in this deeper way, connecting with the deepest truths of eternity and our identity as children of God and so forth.
Speaking of historicity, and by the way, that the identity of the man who died, you talk about it in your book.
The identity of the...
Yeah, were you related to the father who sacrificed himself and was crushed? Where did you hear that story?
It was my grandfather, but
Okay.
I distanced myself from it a little bit because I don't want to offend my family members if they think that I'm saying it's a myth or something. So I tend to distance myself from it a little bit.
Well, I
But
guess
yes,
this is what happens when you use the word myth. You have to kind of put a few train cars after the engine to explain what you mean and what you don't mean. Speaking of historicity, where do you stand on December 25th as the historical date of Christ's birth? I know different Catholic thinkers come down in different places, and I think there's room for amicable disagreement. Where do you stand?
There is. I've written a couple of articles about this. I stand with the idea that, first of all, when they say it's the Saturnalia or some Roman custom, no, there are more differences between Christmas and the Saturnalia than there are similarities. And then they say it has to do with the feast of the birth of the Sun King, or I forget the Roman language for it.
Sola Invictus, I think it was.
That's it, yes.
Yeah.
But of course, when you look into that, you realize that the feast of Sola Invictus actually post-dates the celebration of Christmas.
No!
So if anybody was doing copying here, it was the Roman pagans under Julian the Apostate who was trying to copy the Christians, not the other way around.
Yeah.
But I'm always intrigued by its connection with the Feast of the Annunciation, and that the ancient belief that a great man would die on the same day of his conception, and so. The story goes, therefore, that Jesus died on what is the equivalent of March 25th.
Yeah.
And therefore, he was conceived. The Annunciation was March 25th, and you count 9 months from March 25th, and you get December 25th. Mm-hmm. Well, whether those are the exact precise dates of our Lord's birth is arguable, but certainly it gives the lie to the idea that this was just Christians copying the pagan customs. I mean, this kind of urban myth which is out there on the internet is not only ridiculous for the reasons I've just stated, but also the early Christians in the Roman Empire stood firmly against any paganism. These are people who would die rather than present one grain of incense to the pagan gods. And now you're telling us that they were going around saying, oh, we like the paganism pretty much. Let's adopt this feast from them.
Right.
The whole thing's ludicrous. But therefore, the deeper signification of it connecting with the feast of the Annunciation on March 25th is certainly a deep theological truth to that dating. But there's also no reason why we should suspect that it's untrue historically. And other writers have connected the feast of the Annunciation back with Zacharias, John the Baptist's father, Zacharias, burning incense in the temple when the birth of his son was announced to him by Gabriel. And then they plot the 6 months forward from John the Baptist and Elizabeth's conception, and sure enough, you find March 25th. So there's all sorts of interesting reasons on why Christmas on December 25th or thereabouts is the real date.
I think the motivation to want to hang the date on a pagan feast is sort of like converting a Roman temple, like the Roman temples in Rome that are now Catholic churches, right. Kind of despoiling Egypt of its riches. In other words, taking something inherently pagan and baptizing it with something Christian. But yes. I think, it's still a stretch.
And that did happen, but I don't think it happened in this instance.
Yeah, and I've heard it said it couldn't have been December 25th. Shepherds can't watch their flocks by night. It's too darn cold in Israel. Now, I lead pilgrimages to the Holy Land. Hope to do one at Christmas time, December 27th to January 7th, I suppose. But it's not Arctic blast winds in Israel in December, is it?
It's not. And other people have said, but the lambs are born in the spring. They're not born in the winter. But I forget where I read this particular detail. A particular breed of sheep, which is the one that they have out in the Middle East, they do actually give birth in the winter, not in the spring. So the more we look into these details, the more we find that actually the Bible is actually correct. So
right. Funny about that. It's almost like there's a plan to it. Maybe even divine authorship.
Yeah, funny like that. Yeah, and also not only divine authorship, but it's funny that because maybe, just maybe, it was all written within about 10 years of the actual events taking place,
Right. Well, now that's crazy talk. How can people find out more about you, your blogs, your books, your speaking, and what you do? I've followed your Herculean fundraising and church design there at Our Lady of the Rosary. But just tell us a bit more about what you're doing and how people can connect with you.
Sure. Well, I'm a parish priest in Greenville, South Carolina, as you've said. We built a beautiful new church here in our parish. We're so thrilled with how it's come together. Our people just dug deep and were generous in doing that. And then I have this ministry, writing and speaking, and my blog is at dwightlongenecker.com. I've, over the last 6 months, started a whole series of podcasts as well on church history and supernatural stories. And also I've started a podcast channel called True Fairy Tales, where I discuss fantasy fiction and tell some fairy tales. And I'm working on a project I'm really excited about, which is podcast fiction, a first-person novel in which I tell the story of Father Max Fisher, who's a renegade priest. And the subtext for the whole thing is he thought he was working for the church. They're not so sure.
So, like an audio novel, first-person singular.
Yeah.
And you're the protagonist, the voice, I mean.
I'm taking the voice of the protagonist. It's all fictional, but I'm taking the voice of the protagonist, and it's first person, so it'll be kind of like, here, let me tell you what happened.
Yeah.
I'm telling you this story, okay? It'll be really sort of immediate like that. In fact, I'm not even writing the whole script. I've got the whole thing worked out, but I'm just going to tell the story. So it should be interesting.
I like how you claim it's merely fictional, but we'll move on.
No, it'll be fictional, believe me.
Methinks thou doth protest too much.
Yeah.
Well, Father Dwight Longenecker, always enjoy reading your stuff. I remember being one of my first conversations with you was about your book, More Christianity, about Catholicism, and it needs more readers to it. So I'm happy to send people to the link at patrickcoffin.media. Also happy to not talk about the church abuse scandal for once. It's awesome.
Yeah. People say, why don't I talk more about that? And I say, because everybody else is. And so that they can, and I've got some other good stuff to do. I would just say, too, to any of your listeners, the donor subscribers on my blog, I have a special promotion at the moment, and they get a free copy of any of my books if they want. And it's just till December 2nd, so not too much longer. Okay, that's dwightlongenecker.com. It's LONGENECKER. That's correct. Very good. Well, a blessed Advent to you. Say hi to Allison and all our friends there in Greenville. And thanks for joining us. Thank you very much. All right. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Don't miss next week. The guests next week are two of my favorites. I tell the story at the top of the show. It's called Donna Reed's two daughters. Her real-life daughter, Mary Owen, who reached out to me after I wrote an essay about the movie It's a Wonderful Life. Donna Reed played James Stewart's wife, Mary Hatch. So her real-life daughter, Mary Owen, gives talks in New York around Christmas time as a Q&A session before the viewing of It's a Wonderful Life. Wonderful lady. Also, the fictional daughter of Donna Reed. Do you remember the character Zuzu, Zuzu's Petals, the daughter of Donna Reed and Jimmy Stewart, Mary and George Bailey? Actress Caroline Grimes is also the guest. That's next week. Mary Owen and Caroline Grimes. Donna Reed's two daughters. There are only two living cast members, so it's a real treasure. I think you're going to love it. It's from last year, but believe me, it's evergreen. It's like Holly Evergreen. So if I don't speak to you before, Merry Christmas and a blessed Advent. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there? Yes. Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.